Formula One legend Lewis Hamilton surprised fans by launching a worldwide search for Robert Mitchell, the driving instructor who shaped his career at age 17. After discovering Mitchell now works 2 jobs to make ends meet, Hamilton was determined to find the man whose early guidance helped create a champion. Lewis Hamilton wiped sweat from his forehead as he carried plates to table 7. The restaurant was busy tonight. His legs ached from standing all day, but he didn't mind. Every pound he earned brought him closer to his dream. "Lewis, your dad's here," called Jenny from behind the counter. Lewis looked up to see his father, Anthony, waiting by the door. He quickly finished serving the table and rushed over. "Hey, Dad," Lewis said with a smile. At 17, he was thin but strong, with determination in his eyes. "Ready for tomorrow, son?" Anthony asked, his voice filled with pride. Lewis nodded. "Been ready my whole life." Tomorrow was special. After years of racing karts and saving every penny, Lewis would take his first professional driving lesson at the Jim Russell Racing School at Silverstone Circuit, the same track where Formula One cars raced each year. "I picked up an extra shift this week," Lewis said. "Should help with the gas money to get there." Anthony shook his head. "Don't worry about that. You just focus on showing them what you can do." At home that night, Lewis couldn't sleep. He stared at the posters on his bedroom wall in their small house in Stevenage. Ayrton Senna, his hero, looked back at him from faded paper. Lewis had watched Senna's races over and over on their old VCR. He knew every move, every turn. One day, Lewis whispered to himself, "That'll be me." Morning came quickly. Lewis and Anthony drove the 60 miles to Silverstone in their old car packed with Lewis's gear. The track looked massive as they pulled in, much bigger than the karting tracks Lewis knew so well. Hamilton? A tall man with gray at his temples approached them in the parking lot. "I'm Robert Mitchell, your instructor today." Lewis shook his hand firmly, the way his father had taught him. "Nice to meet you, sir," Lewis said. Robert smiled. "Save the sir for the track. Let's see what you've got." Inside, other students chatted excitedly. Most were older than Lewis, and many had expensive racing gear. Lewis clutched his worn helmet, suddenly feeling out of place. "Don't worry about them," Robert said quietly, noticing Lewis's unease. "It's not about what you wear or where you come from. It's about what you do behind the wheel." The morning class covered racing lines, braking points, and safety procedures. Lewis sat up straight, taking notes in a small notebook. While others looked bored during the classroom session, Lewis asked questions that surprised Robert. "You've really studied this, haven't you?" Robert asked during a break. Lewis nodded. "Every night, I watch races and try to figure out why drivers make the choices they do." After lunch, it was time to drive. Lewis's heart pounded as he slipped into the Formula Ford car. It was nothing like his kart, more powerful, more complex. "Just take it slow at first," Robert instructed through the radio. "Get a feel for the car." Lewis took a deep breath and pulled onto the track. The engine roared as he carefully navigated the first turn. By the third lap, something clicked. The car began to feel like an extension of his body. He hit the braking points perfectly and accelerated out of corners with precision that made Robert raise his eyebrows. When the session ended, the other instructors gathered around Robert's timing screen. "Who's that in car 5?" one asked. "New kid. First time in a race car," Robert replied. "Can't be. Look at these sector times." At the end of the day, Robert pulled Lewis aside. "You've got something special, Lewis. I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've never seen a first-timer drive like that." Lewis beamed. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell." "Tell you what," Robert said, looking around to make sure no one else could hear. "If you can get here an hour early tomorrow, I'll show you some techniques they don't teach in the regular class." Lewis looked at his father, who nodded with a smile. "We'll be here," Anthony said. That night, driving home, Lewis was quiet. "Everything okay?" Anthony asked. "Yeah," Lewis said, staring out the window. "I just feel like this is it, Dad. This is the beginning of everything we've worked for." Anthony reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. "This is just the start, Lewis. You're going to show the world what a boy from Stevenage can do." Lewis nodded, watching. The sunset paint the sky orange. In his mind, he was already back on the track, learning everything Robert could teach him, racing toward a future that seemed suddenly possible. 5 years had passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. Lewis Hamilton stood in the gleaming McLaren garage, running his fingers over the sleek silver and red Formula One car that bore his name and the number 22. He could hardly believe it was real. "Ready for your first race weekend?" Ron Dennis, the McLaren team boss, placed a hand on Lewis's shoulder. "Born ready," Lewis replied with a confident smile, though butterflies danced in his stomach. It was 2007, and at 22 years old, Lewis was about to become the first black driver in Formula One. The journey from Silverstone's training school to this moment had been incredible. Formula Renault, Formula 3, GP2. He had won in every category, just as he had promised his father he would. As mechanics swarmed around his car, Lewis's mind drifted back to those early lessons with Robert Mitchell. He could still hear Robert's tapritant voice, "Brake later than you think you can, but smoother than you think you should." That advice had saved him countless times in tight corners. Where was Robert now? Lewis had tried to find him last year after winning the GP2 championship. But the racing school had new owners who didn't know where the old instructors had gone. "Hamilton! Press conference in 5, a team member called. The Australian Grand Prix flew by in a blur of speed and adrenaline. When Lewis crossed the finish line in 3rd place, a podium in his very first Formula One race, the paddock buzzed with excitement about the rookie sensation. "You drove like a champion today," his teammate Fernando Alonso said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. Race after race, Lewis shocked the racing world. Monaco, Canada, USA, he stood on podiums alongside drivers he had once collected, autographs from as a child. Journalists called him the most impressive rookie in F1 history. During a rare week off, Lewis sat in his new apartment in Switzerland, scrolling through old photos on his laptop. There he was at 17, standing proudly at Silverstone with Robert and the other students. Lewis picked up his phone to call his dad. "Have you ever heard from Robert Mitchell?" Lewis asked. "My old instructor?" "Not for years," Anthony replied. "Why don't you try the racing school again?" "I did. They don't have records from back then. It's like he disappeared." Lewis sighed. He had meant to stay in touch, to thank Robert properly. But everything had happened so fast. The wins, the contracts, the move to Switzerland for privacy. People from his past were fading like old photographs. The 2007 season ended in heartbreak. Lewis lost the championship by just 1 point in the final race. As he sat in his quiet hotel room after the Brazilian Grand Prix, he remembered another piece of Robert's advice. "The hardest losses teach you the most important lessons." Those words carried him through the winter and into 2008. This time, Lewis wasn't just a rookie, he was a championship contender. The pressure was immense, his every move scrutinized by millions of fans around the world. The final race in Brazil would again decide the championship. Lewis needed 5th place or better to become world champion. Rain poured down on the track, making conditions treacherous. On the final lap, sitting in fifth place but under attack, Lewis heard Robert's voice in his head. "When it rains, that's your advantage. Feel the grip, don't just look for it." Lewis found the grip on the slippery track and crossed the finish line in fifth place, just enough to win the championship by a single point. As champagne sprayed in the McLaren garage, Lewis hugged his father tightly. "We did it, Dad!" he shouted over the celebration. "We actually did it!" Later that night, alone on his hotel balcony overlooking Sao Paulo, Lewis thought about everyone who had helped him reach this moment. His father, who had worked multiple jobs, his mother, who had supported him from afar, his stepmother, Linda, his brother, Nicholas, and the teachers who had believed in him, and Robert Mitchell, wherever he was. "I'll find you someday," Lewis whispered to the night sky. "I promise." But as the years passed and Lewis's star continued to rise, that promise became harder to keep. The racing world moved quickly, and Lewis moved with it, his life a constant whirlwind of races, press, and commitments. Little did he know that Robert Mitchell was watching his every race, proud of his former student, but feeling the world between them grow larger with each passing championship. Robert Mitchell adjusted, his worn armchair closer to the television. It was 2014, and the Formula One season was about to begin. This year would be different. Lewis Hamilton had left McLaren to join Mercedes, a team that hadn't won much recently. "He's taking a big risk," muttered Robert to his cat, Einstein, who dozed beside him in the small living room of his rented flat in Milton Keynes. The walls were lined with racing memorabilia, mostly items from his own modest career, and photos of successful students. Lewis featured prominently. Robert sipped tea from a chipped mug as the cars lined up on the grid in Australia. His phone rang, but he let it go to voicemail. Race starts were sacred. The voice message was from the Jim Russell Racing School's new owners. "Mr. Mitchell, we're sorry to inform you that your position has been eliminated due to budget cuts. Your final paycheck." Robert deleted the message before it finished. He'd seen this coming. The school had changed hands twice in recent years, each new owner cutting back more than the last. At 58, with no championship titles to his name and an old knee injury that acted up in the cold, finding another racing job would be nearly impossible. On screen, Lewis Hamilton guided his silver Mercedes through the first corner in Melbourne. "Good line," Robert nodded approvingly. "Just like I taught you." By Monday morning, Robert had updated his resume and begun making calls to old contacts in the racing world. By Friday, he knew the truth. There were no jobs for aging driving instructors with outdated credentials. "Just need something temporary," he told himself, "until the racing world remembers who I am." The temporary job came as a taxi driver. The hours were long, the pay was modest, but at least he was driving. Some days, Robert would take detours through country roads between fares, pretending he was back on the track. His passengers never complained. They enjoyed his smooth, precise driving style. "You drive like a professional," a businessman commented one day. Robert smiled. "Used to teach Formula One drivers." The man looked skeptical. "Really? Anyone I'd know?" "Lewis Hamilton, for one." The businessman laughed. "Right, and I'm friends with the Queen." "Good one, mate." After that, Robert stopped mentioning his past. It was easier that way. 2 years slipped by. Robert added a night job at a petrol station near Silverstone to make ends meet. The station was popular with racing teams during event weekends, but Robert usually worked quiet weekday nights when few customers came by. On the small television behind the counter, Robert watched Lewis win championship after championship with Mercedes. 2014, 2015, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 6 world titles with Mercedes, 7 in total, equaling Michael Schumacher's record. "That's my boy," Robert would whisper when no one was around to hear. Sometimes a customer would come in wearing Mercedes team gear. "Fan of Lewis?" Robert would ask casually. "Best driver ever," one young fan replied, "but I wish he'd stop with all the politics and just drive." Robert shook his head. The great ones always stand for something more than just winning. The young man shrugged and paid for his crisps and energy drink. Robert's flat grew smaller over the years as rising rents forced him to downsize. His racing memorabilia now crowded the walls of a studio apartment. Only Einstein the cat remained from his former life, older and grumpier, but still good company. One night, Robert found an old notebook from his teaching days. Inside were his notes on each student, including several pages dedicated to young Lewis. Hamilton, exceptional feel for grip limits. Brakes later than experienced drivers, but always finds the apex. Natural understanding of weight transfer. Could be the greatest talent I've ever seen. Below these notes was Lewis's phone number from 2002. Robert stared at it for a long time, his finger hovering over his phone. He could call. Maybe Lewis would remember him. Then reality crashed in. Lewis Hamilton was now one of the most famous athletes on the planet. He wouldn't have the same number. And even if Robert could reach him, what would he say? "Remember me? I'm working 2 jobs now and could use some help?" No. Robert had too much pride for that. He closed the notebook and put it away. The next morning, driving his taxi, Robert picked up an elderly passenger who recognized his name on the driver ID. "Mitchell, weren't you a racing driver once?" "Instructor, mainly," Robert replied, surprised. "Thought so. My grandson raced go-karts. Said you were the best teacher at Silverstone back in the day." Robert smiled. "That's kind of him to say." "Whatever happened to your career?" the man asked innocently. Robert paused, watching the familiar countryside roll by. "Life happened, I suppose." That evening, Robert stood behind the counter at the petrol station, watching the news announce that the British Grand Prix would return to Silverstone the following weekend. Lewis Hamilton would be going for a record 8th win at his home track. "Maybe I'll finally see you again," Robert said to Lewis's image on the screen. Even if you don't see me, he had no idea how true those words would prove to be. July 2021 brought perfect racing weather to Silverstone. Lewis Hamilton arrived at the track on Thursday, 2 days before qualifying for the British Grand Prix. At 36, he was now the most successful Formula One driver of all time, but this season was proving difficult. His young rival, Max Verstappen, led the championship in his Red Bull car. The Mercedes team garage buzzed with activity as engineers worked on the cars. Lewis nodded to his crew, then slipped into a private room where his race engineer waited with data from the simulator. "The car feels better," Lewis said after reviewing the numbers. "But we're still losing time in turn 7. As night fell over Silverstone, Lewis felt restless in his luxury motorhome. The pressure of the championship battle weighed on him. Millions of fans expected him to win his 8th title, breaking Michael Schumacher's record. But right now, that seemed far from certain. "Going for a drive," he texted his trainer. "Need to clear my head." Lewis chose his least flashy car, a matty black electric Mercedes, and headed out alone. He drove without a destination in mind, taking country roads away from the track. The quiet villages of Northamptonshire slipped by as he let his mind wander. He thought about the journey, from karting as a kid to becoming the most winning driver in F1 history. So many people had helped along the way. His dad working multiple jobs, Ron Dennis taking a chance on him, his team believing in him year after year. Lost in thought, Lewis didn't notice the fuel gauge dropping until a warning light blinked on the dashboard. Despite driving an electric car, he had activated the small reserve gas engine that extended the range, and now it needed fuel. Perfect timing, he muttered, spotting a small petrol station up ahead. It was nearly midnight, and the place looked almost deserted. Lewis pulled up to the pump and stepped out. The cool night air felt good after the stuffiness of the car. He began filling the tank, then noticed the small shop was still open. A solitary figure visible behind the counter. The bell jingled as Lewis entered the shop. He grabbed a bottle of water and some energy bars, then approached the counter. The attendant was an older man with gray hair and reading glasses, focused on a racing magazine. He looked up as Lewis approached. Just these and the fuel at pump. 3, Lewis said, placing the items on the counter. The man's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly composed himself, scanning the items with practiced movements. "Big race this weekend," the man said casually. "You going to watch it?" Lewis smiled. It was refreshing when people didn't recognize him. "Yeah, I might catch some of it." "Supporting anyone in particular?" the man asked, bagging the items. "Mercedes," Lewis replied. "I've followed them for a while." The man nodded. "Hamilton's got a tough fight this year. That Verstappen boy is mighty quick." "He is," Lewis agreed. "But Silverstone suits the Mercedes. Higher speed corners, longer wheelbase car. If Hamilton can nail the setup, especially through Copse and Maggots Beckett's, he's got a chance." The attendant looked up with interest. "You know you're racing." Lewis shrugged. "Been a fan for years." "The thing about Hamilton," the man continued, "is he's not just fast, he's smart. Knows when to push and when to save the car. Not many drivers have that instinct." "You think he'll win the championship?" Lewis asked, curious about the man's opinion. The attendant leaned on the counter, considering. "If anyone can pull it back, it's him. I've been watching racing for over 40 years, and he's the most complete driver I've ever seen." Lewis felt a strange connection to this man. Something about the way he talked about racing. It was technical but passionate, like someone who'd lived it. "You race yourself?" Lewis asked. The man's eyes crinkled with a smile. "A lifetime ago. Nothing serious. Taught for many years, though." Lewis was about to ask more when his phone buzzed loudly. His team was calling. "Sorry, I need to take this," he said, stepping away from the counter. It was his race engineer, asking about a setup change they wanted to try tomorrow. Lewis discussed the details, then noticed the time. "I should get back," he told the engineer. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." When Lewis returned to the counter, the attendant had finished bagging his items. Something about the man's eyes seemed familiar, but Lewis couldn't place it. "That'll be 47 Baldur's 82, the man said. Lewis handed over his card. "Thanks for the racing, chat. Nice to meet a true fan." "Been following since the karting days," the man replied, with a small smile. "Good luck this weekend." Lewis paused. "What makes you think I'm going to the race?" The attendant gestured to Lewis's Mercedes team shirt, peeking out from under his jacket. "Just a guess." Lewis laughed and picked up his bag. "Thanks again. What's your name?" "Robert," the man replied. "Robert Mitchell." Lewis repeated the name, a flicker of recognition passing across his face, but not quite connecting. "Good to meet you, Robert. Maybe see you at the track." "Doubt it," Robert said. "Working the night shift all weekend." Lewis nodded and headed toward the door. "Well, enjoy the race on TV then." As Lewis drove back to the track, the name Robert Mitchell circled in his mind. It sounded so familiar, but he couldn't place it. By the time he reached the Silverstone complex, his mind had shifted back to tomorrow's practice sessions and the challenge of beating Verstappen. The man at the petrol station was already fading from memory, just another brief encounter on the long road of life. Back at the station, Robert Mitchell watched Lewis's car disappear into the night. He hadn't expected Lewis to recognize him after all these years. People saw what they expected to see: a nobody working a night shift, not someone who had once been important in their life. Robert touched the faded Silverstone instructor badge he still kept in his wallet. "Good luck, Lewis," he whispered. "Show them what I always knew you could do." The crowd roared as Lewis Hamilton crossed the finish line, winning the British Grand Prix for a record 8th time. The Union Jack fluttered in his hand as he stood on top of his car, soaking in the cheers from his home fans. Despite a controversial collision with Verstappen early in the race, Lewis had fought back to claim a crucial victory. "This one's for you, the best fans in the world," Lewis shouted into the microphone on the podium, champagne dripping from his racing suit. "We never gave up." In the cool-down room before the ceremony, Lewis had felt something special, a clarity in his driving he hadn't experienced in months. Somehow, he had found an extra gear when he needed it most. The press conference was packed with journalists eager to ask about the incident with Verstappen. Lewis answered each question calmly, explaining his view of the racing situation. Then, a reporter from a small racing magazine raised his hand. "Lewis, you've been racing for nearly 20 years now. Who were the early influences that shaped your driving style? The people before McLaren and Mercedes?" Lewis paused, taking a sip of water. "Well, obviously my dad was the biggest influence. He sacrificed everything so I could race karts. He taught me to never give up, to work harder than everyone else," he continued. "Then there were the karting days with Ron Dennis watching over my progress. Those experiences shaped me fundamentally." As Lewis spoke, a shadow crossed his mind. The feeling that he was forgetting someone important. A face half-remembered. Words of wisdom that had stayed with him through the years. "Anyone else?" the reporter pressed. "Any instructors who saw something special?" Lewis frowned slightly. "There were many people who helped along the way. Too many to name right now." That night, back in his hotel suite, Lewis couldn't sleep. The question had triggered something, a memory trying to surface. He scrolled through social media, reading congratulatory messages from celebrities and fans, but his mind kept wandering. The man at the petrol station, Robert Mitchell. Why did that name sound so familiar? Lewis got out of bed and opened his laptop. He kept digital copies of old photos, organized by year. He clicked on the folder marked 2002, the year he turned 17, the year before. He joined Formula 3 photos loaded on the screen. Lewis in his Formula Renault car, celebrating wins, standing with his father. He scrolled further and stopped suddenly at a group photo taken at Silverstone. The Jim Russell Racing School. Lewis, significantly younger, stood among a group of students. Behind them were the instructors in their blue uniforms. Lewis zoomed in on one face and felt his heart skip. The instructor standing directly behind him was younger, with darker hair, but the eyes were unmistakable. The nameplate on his uniform read, R. Mitchell. "Robert," Lewis whispered, the memories flooding back. The special training sessions early in the mornings. The racing lines Robert had taught him that no one else used. The advice about feeling the car's balance rather than just driving by numbers. The extra hour Robert spent with him after each day, analyzing his laps in detail. Lewis grabbed his phone and called his personal assistant, despite the late hour. "Sorry to wake you," he said when she answered. "I need you to find someone for me, Robert Mitchell. He was my instructor at the Jim Russell Racing School in 2002. At this hour?" his assistant asked, her voice groggy. "No, tomorrow is fine, but it's important," Lewis insisted. "I'll see what I can do," she promised. Lewis couldn't get back to sleep. He paced the hotel room, more memories surfacing with each minute. Robert, teaching him how to conserve tires while maintaining speed. Robert, showing him how to adapt his driving style to changing weather conditions. Small lessons that had made massive differences in his career. And now, Robert was working at a petrol station near Silverstone. The thought made Lewis's stomach twist with guilt. Why hadn't he recognized him immediately? How long had Robert been working there? What had happened to his teaching career? Lewis picked up his phone again and called his father. "Dad, do you remember Robert Mitchell, my instructor at Silverstone?" Anthony was silent for a moment. "Of course I remember him. Why?" "I think I just met him at a petrol station near the track. He's working nights there now." Another pause. "Are you sure it was him?" "I just found an old photo. It's definitely him," Lewis said. He didn't say anything about who he was. He just let me walk away. "Robert was always a proud man," Anthony said quietly. "Never wanted recognition for what he did." Lewis stared out the window at the lights of Silverstone in the distance. "I need to find him again, Dad. I need to thank him properly." "You should," Anthony agreed. "Some debts can never be fully repaid, but they should always be acknowledged." As dawn broke over Silverstone, Lewis made a promise to himself. He would find Robert Mitchell and thank him for everything he had done. The man who had seen his potential before anyone else deserved to share in the success he had helped create. What Lewis didn't know was how difficult that promise would be to keep. "I went back to the petrol station this morning, but he wasn't there," Lewis's assistant, Emma, reported. They were sitting in Lewis's private room at the Mercedes motorhome. The team was packing up after the British Grand Prix weekend. The manager said Robert works night shifts, but he's off today. Lewis nodded, disappointed but determined. "What about the racing school records?" "That's the problem. The school changed hands multiple times since 2002. The current owners don't have employee records going back that far." Emma scrolled through notes on her tablet. "I've reached out to some former instructors through social media, but no solid leads yet." Lewis rubbed his temples, frustrated. Finding one man in England shouldn't be this difficult, especially when that man had been so important. "What else do we know about him?" Lewis asked. Emma pulled up a document. Robert Mitchell, 58 years old according to the gas station employment records. Former racing driver in lower formulas in the 1980s and early 90s. Never made it to F1. Became an instructor at Silverstone in 1996. Any family? Address? The station manager wouldn't share personal information. Privacy laws. Emma hesitated. "I did find something interesting, though. He had a promising career until an accident at Brands Hatch in 1992. Shattered his left knee. Ended his racing dreams right there." Lewis winced. Racing was cruel that way. Careers could end in seconds. He taught at the school for 15 years, Emma continued. Left in 2012 during budget cuts. After that, the trail goes cold until he shows up working at the gas station 3 years ago. Lewis stood up and paced the small room. He must have friends, colleagues, someone who knows where to find him. "We're looking," Emma assured him. "I've contacted the taxi companies in the area too. Someone mentioned he drives a taxi during the day." Lewis paused. Wait, he works 2 jobs? At his age? Emma nodded. Seems that way. A knock interrupted them. Toto Wolff, the Mercedes team principal, entered. Sorry to disturb, but we need to discuss the Hungary strategy before you leave. Of course, Lewis said, but his mind remained on Robert. Later, as the Mercedes team prepared to fly to Hungary for the next race, Lewis made a decision. He called his most trusted team member aside. I need someone to stay behind, Lewis explained. Find this man, but be discreet. I don't want a media circus around him. I understand, the team member replied. But what's so special about this instructor? Lewis looked out at the Silverstone track, remembering the lessons learned there. He saw something in me before anyone else did. He invested extra time in me, taught me techniques that I still use today. I might not be here without him. 2 days later, Lewis was preparing for the Hungarian Grand Prix when he received a text from his team in England. Found the taxi company. Privacy rules prevent them from giving employee information, but they confirmed a Robert Mitchell works there. Lewis texted back quickly, "Did someone go there?" "Yes." They said he's on a route today, but wouldn't say where. We left contact information with dispatch. Lewis tried to focus on the race weekend, but his thoughts kept drifting to Robert. Why? Hadn't he called? Was he avoiding Lewis? After qualifying third in Hungary, Lewis returned to his hotel to find another update. Someone went to the gas station during Robert's shift. Manager said he called in sick. First time in 3 years. Lewis frowned at the message. The timing seemed suspicious. Had Robert figured out Lewis was looking for him? Was he deliberately staying away? What should we do next? The text continued. Lewis thought for a moment, then typed, "Go public. Satyuham." Response came quickly. "Are you sure? The media will swarm this story." Lewis knew the risks. Once he put Robert's name out there, journalists would hunt him down. Robert's quiet life would be upended. But what choice did he have? He called Toto Wolff. "I need your advice on something personal." After explaining the situation, Lewis waited for Toto's opinion. "This man clearly values his privacy," Toto said carefully. "Perhaps there's a reason he didn't tell you who he was at the gas station." "I know," Lewis agreed, "but I need to thank him properly. He deserves recognition." Toto was silent for a moment. "Sometimes people don't want recognition, Lewis. Sometimes a quiet life is a choice." The words stuck with Lewis as he prepared for the race. Could Toto be right? Was he being selfish, wanting to bring Robert back into his life? But after finishing second in Hungary, Lewis made his decision. During the post-race press conference, a journalist asked about his mindset going into the summer break. "I've been reflecting a lot lately on the people who helped me get here," Lewis said carefully. "Actually, I'm hoping to reconnect with someone important from my early career." The journalist perked up. "Anyone we would know?" Lewis took a deep breath. "His name is Robert Mitchell. He was my instructor at the Jim Russell Racing School when I was 17. I recently learned he's working 2 jobs now, and I'd very much like to speak with him again." Lewis knew that by this time tomorrow, Robert's name would be all over social media. Racing fans would be searching for information. The quiet life Robert had built would be examined under the spotlight of Lewis's fame. He hoped Robert would forgive him for that. What Lewis didn't know was that Robert had already seen the race press conference, watching in stunned silence from the small television in his flat. Einstein the cat curled beside him. "Oh, Lewis," Robert whispered to the screen. "What have you done?" Morning arrived with the soft ping of a text message on Lewis's phone. He reached for it, still half asleep in his luxury Monaco apartment. The Formula One summer break had just begun, giving drivers a rare 4-week stretch of freedom. Boss wants to discuss testing plans for the new front wing. Team meeting at 10, the message read. Lewis sighed. Even during the break, the work never truly stopped. He padded across the polished floor to the balcony, where the Mediterranean sparkled in the morning sun. Below, his yacht bobbed gently in the harbor alongside other million-dollar vessels. 12,000 feet above, a commercial airliner carried Robert Mitchell back to England from his sister's home in Scotland, where he had retreated after Lewis's press conference. Robert gazed out the small window at the clouds below, a simple coffee in a plastic cup growing cold in his hand. "Anything else I can get you, sir?" a flight attendant asked. Robert shook his head. "No, thank you." His phone held 27 missed calls and 43 messages from numbers he didn't recognize. Journalists, probably. After Lewis's mention of his name, it had taken less than an hour for reporters to find his taxi company and the gas station. His manager had called, saying people were asking questions about him. Might be good for business, having a celebrity connection, his manager had suggested. Robert had immediately requested a week of emergency leave and booked a flight to his sister's remote cottage in the Highlands. No television, no internet. A perfect hiding place, but he couldn't hide forever. By noon, Lewis was sitting in a climate-controlled meeting room with Mercedes engineers, discussing millisecond improvements to the car. His nutritionist had prepared a perfectly balanced lunch, grilled chicken, quinoa, and steamed vegetables. His performance coach waited nearby for their afternoon training session. "We need to find another 2/10 in Sector 2, the chief engineer explained, pointing at telemetry data on a large screen. Lewis nodded, making notes on his tablet. "I think we can change the approach to turn 7. Let me show you." At the same moment, Robert's taxi pulled up to a small cafe in Milton Keynes. He had 1 hour for lunch before his afternoon shift began. The cafe owner, Ahmed, greeted him warmly. "The usual, Robert." "Please," Robert replied, settling into his corner booth. The usual was a simple ham sandwich and cup of tea. Total cost, $5.60. Robert pulled a worn racing magazine from his jacket pocket. As he flipped through the pages, a small newspaper clipping fell out. A photo of 17-year-old Lewis Hamilton winning at Brands Hatch, with a quote mentioning the excellent coaching he'd received at Silverstone. Robert had carried this clipping in his wallet for nearly 20 years. Back in Monaco, Lewis finished his meeting and stepped onto his private balcony. His phone buzzed with messages from celebrity friends inviting him to exclusive parties. His calendar showed upcoming photo shoots for luxury brand endorsements. An assistant had arranged his private jet for a trip to New York that weekend. Success had brought Lewis everything he'd dreamed of as a boy, and more. Yet, something still felt missing. In Milton Keynes, Robert climbed back into his taxi. His first passenger was a businessman heading to London. "Been driving taxis long?" the man asked, barely looking up from his phone. "About 8 years now," Robert replied. "Before that, I taught people how to race cars." The businessman looked up briefly. "Really? Anyone famous?" Robert hesitated. "A few went on to good careers." "Like who?" the man pressed. "Oh, no one you'd know," Robert said, changing the subject. "How's traffic looking on the M1? Evening brought different routines to each man. Lewis worked out in his private gym with his trainer, followed by a massage and a dinner prepared by his personal chef. Then he sat on his balcony with his bulldog, Roscoe, scrolling through social media, where millions of fans analyzed his every post. Robert clocked out of the taxi service and headed straight to the gas station for his night shift. He ate a sandwich he had packed that morning and fed Einstein. Before leaving, the cat was his only audience as he muttered about rude customers and traffic jams. When a late-night customer mentioned the big story about Lewis Hamilton looking for his old teacher, Robert simply nodded and rang up the purchase. Heard they're still trying to find the guy, the customer continued. Is that right? Robert replied noncommittally. As midnight approached, both men found themselves alone with their thoughts. Lewis stared at the old photo from Silverstone, wondering where Robert was right now. Robert counted his day's earnings, wondering if he could afford to fix the leaking roof in his flat. Two lives that had once intersected so meaningfully, now separated by more than just distance. 2 weeks into the summer break, Lewis Hamilton sat in his London apartment, frustrated. Despite his team's best efforts, Robert Mitchell remained elusive. The taxi company cited privacy policies. The gas station manager reported that Robert had taken a leave of absence. Even visiting Robert's last known address led nowhere. He'd moved out 3 years ago with no forwarding address. We've tried everything, Emma said during their morning call. Short of hiring a private investigator, Lewis paced the room, thinking, what about social media? My platforms reach millions. Are you sure you want to make this so public? Emma asked cautiously. Lewis had considered this carefully. Going public might overwhelm Robert, but what choice did he have? The summer break would end soon, and once racing resumed, finding time for this search would be nearly impossible. I'm sure, Lewis decided. Draft a post for my accounts. Keep it simple, respectful. Make it clear this is important to me personally. An hour later, Lewis approved the final draft. He added a personal touch, a never-before-shared photo from 2002, showing 17-year-old Lewis standing beside Robert at Silverstone, both smiling after Lewis's first test in a Formula Renault car. Lewis typed the caption himself. This man changed my life. Robert Mitchell was my instructor at Silverstone when I was 17. He saw potential in me and spent extra hours teaching me skills I still use today. I recently discovered he's working as a taxi driver and at a gas station near Silverstone. I'd love to reconnect and thank him properly. If you know Robert, please help us connect. This means a lot to me. Find Robert Mitchell. His finger hovered over the post button. Would this help or hurt? Was he being selfish? Taking a deep breath, Lewis pressed post. Within minutes, the post exploded across the internet. Fans shared it thousands of times. Find Robert Mitchell started trending. Media outlets picked up the story, running headlines like Hamilton's heartfelt hunt for humble hero and champion searches for forgotten mentor. In a small cafe in Manchester, Robert's sister Mary showed him the post on her phone. You need to call him, she urged. This is getting out of hand. Robert shook his head. It's not that simple, Mary. Why not? He clearly respects you. He wants to thank you. What's the problem? Robert couldn't explain, not even to his sister, the complicated feelings this situation stirred up. Pride, embarrassment, fear that Lewis might feel obligated to help him financially, and deeper reasons he couldn't share. I'll handle it my own way, he said firmly. Meanwhile, responses flooded Lewis's social media. Hundreds claimed to know Robert. Dozens of driving instructors pretended to be him. Internet sleuths dug up old racing results, finding Robert's modest career stats. Someone even created a Robert Mitchell fan club account. During a video call with his father, Lewis expressed his growing concern. Maybe this was a mistake, he admitted. What if he doesn't want to be found? Anthony Hamilton considered this. That's possible, but you still need to try. Some things need to be said, even if they're difficult. Lewis nodded, remembering their own complicated history. He and his father had managed racing together until Lewis made the painful decision to end their professional relationship in 2010. Their personal connection had suffered for years afterward. Eventually, they rebuilt their relationship, but Lewis never forgot how hard it was to say the necessary things. The next morning, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A woman named Sarah Edwards messaged Lewis's official account. "My daughter takes piano lessons in Milton Keynes. The teacher's cat sitter is Robert Mitchell's neighbor. Robert doesn't use social media and has no idea how big this has become. He's been working night shifts and sleeping days to avoid journalists. I can pass a message if you want." Lewis immediately replied, asking Sarah to give Robert his private number. "Please tell him I just want to thank him properly. No media, no fuss. Just a conversation between two people who once meant something to each other's journey." Lewis put down his phone, hoping the message would reach Robert. The ball was now in his former instructor's court. But sometimes, the universe has its own timeline for reunions. 7 days passed with no word from Robert. Lewis tried to focus on preparing for the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps, the first race after the summer break. His mornings filled with physical training, his afternoons with technical briefings, but his thoughts kept drifting to the instructor who had helped shape his career. Robert Mitchell had returned to his normal routine, though nothing felt normal anymore. His gas station manager had told him to take all the time you need after reporters started hanging around. The taxi company was more direct. "Come back when this blows over. Customers don't like being interviewed about you." Today was different, though. Today, Robert had taken a rare day off to watch the Belgian Grand Prix qualifying. Formula One had always been his escape, even before his brief connection to Lewis. Now he sat in his small living room, Einstein purring on his lap, as the pre-qualifying show began on television. Welcome to Spa, where the big story remains Lewis Hamilton's search for his former driving instructor, the presenter announced. For those just joining our coverage, Hamilton made an emotional appeal on social media to find Robert Mitchell, who taught him at Silverstone when he was 17. Robert sighed. Would they ever stop talking about it? "We have some exclusive footage to show you," the presenter continued. This is from Hamilton's earlier career, previously unreleased. Robert's breath caught as grainy video appeared on screen. It showed a teenage Lewis Hamilton sitting beside him in a classroom at Silverstone. Robert was explaining racing lines, drawing on a whiteboard. The camera zoomed in as Robert placed a hand on young Lewis's shoulder, pointing at something on the board. "Where did they find that?" Robert whispered to Einstein. He had no idea anyone had filmed those sessions. The presenter's voice continued over the footage. Sources close to Hamilton say he credits Mitchell with teaching him advanced techniques that contributed significantly to his later success. The camera returned to the studio, where the presenters were now joined by a former Formula One driver. "What difference can a good instructor make at that age?" the host asked. "Enormous," the ex-driver replied. "At 17, you have raw talent, but not refinement. A skilled teacher can shape how you approach racing forever. If Hamilton says this man was important, I believe him." Robert stood up abruptly, disturbing Einstein, who leapt to the floor with an indignant meow. He needed to call the TV station. They shouldn't be using footage of him without permission. Besides, what if Lewis was watching? What if this made him feel even more obligated to help Robert? Robert fumbled for his phone, then realized he didn't even know how to contact the network. As he searched online for a number, qualifying began. He paused, watching Lewis guide his Mercedes through the rain-soaked circuit, masterfully controlling the car in treacherous conditions. "Outside front tire," Robert muttered, as Lewis approached a particularly difficult corner. "Ease off just a fraction before turn in." As if hearing the advice across the miles, Lewis did exactly that. carrying perfect speed through the corner and setting the fastest time in that sector. Pride swelled in Robert's chest. Whatever happened? Between them now, no one could take away the fact that he'd contributed to this extraordinary talent. When qualifying ended, Robert made a decision. He found an old box in his closet containing his racing memorabilia. Inside was his Silverstone instructor credential from 2002, his racing licenses, and photos from his teaching days. He packed these carefully into a small bag. "I'm not waiting for him to find me anymore," he told Einstein. "Time to take control of this situation." Robert booked a flight to Abu Dhabi for the final race of the season in December. It would take nearly all his savings, but somehow that seemed right. He'd started Lewis's journey. Perhaps he should be there, at the end of what might be his record-breaking season. Meanwhile, Lewis had qualified on pole position, his mind surprisingly clear despite the distractions of recent weeks. In the post-qualifying press conference, a journalist inevitably asked about Robert. "Any progress finding your former instructor?" Lewis shook his head. "Not yet, but I haven't given up. Some connections are too important to let go." What neither man knew was that at that very moment, the message Lewis had sent through Sarah Edwards was finally reaching Robert's neighbor, who would deliver it the following morning. Like two stars with intersecting orbits, they were drawing closer to each other again, but not quite close enough. Not just yet. The Formula One season rushed by like a blur. Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen battled fiercely for the championship, trading wins and controversy. With 2 races to go, they were tied on points, something that hadn't happened in decades. Robert Mitchell followed every race, watching Lewis fight with the same determination he'd shown as a teenager. He had received Lewis's message through his neighbor but hadn't responded. Not yet. Something held him back, a promise made long ago that still weighed on his conscience. As December arrived, bringing cold winds to England, Robert packed his small suitcase for Abu Dhabi. The flight had cost most of his savings, but he'd managed to find an affordable hotel far from the glamorous center of the city. "You sure about this?" his sister Mary asked over the phone. "Why not just call him?" "Some things need to be said face to face," Robert replied. The next day, Robert boarded his economy-class flight, clutching his carry-on bag containing his old racing credentials and photos, his only proof of who he was and his connection to the 7-time world champion. 12 hours later, Robert emerged into the scorching heat of Abu Dhabi. The contrast with cold England was shocking. He took a budget taxi to his hotel, watching the magnificent Yas Marina circuit come into view as they drove, its striking blue and white architecture gleaming in the desert sun. "For the race?" the driver asked, noticing Robert's gaze. "Yes," Robert replied simply. "Hamilton or Verstappen?" Robert smiled. "Hamilton. Always Hamilton." The next morning, race day, Robert took another taxi to the circuit. He hadn't been able to afford a ticket, but he hoped his old racing credentials might help him get close enough to send a message to Lewis's team. At the main entrance, fans streamed in wearing team merchandise. Robert approached a security guard, his heart pounding. "Excuse me," he began. "I need to get a message to Lewis Hamilton's team." The guard looked unimpressed. "Sir, everyone wants to meet the drivers. You need a pass to enter." Robert pulled out his old Silverstone instructor badge. "I'm Robert Mitchell. I used to be his instructor. He's been looking for me." The guard's expression didn't change. "Sir, I've heard 10 different Robert Mitchells this weekend alone. Without proper credentials, I can't let you in." Robert's shoulders slumped. He had come so far, only to be stopped at the gate. He moved away from the entrance, finding a spot in the shade. What now? Inside the circuit, Lewis Hamilton sat in the Mercedes garage, trying to focus. Qualifying hadn't gone well. He would start from an unusual 5th position, making his path to the championship much harder. "You seem distracted," Toto Wolff observed. Fine," Lewis insisted, though he wasn't. The search for Robert had continued to weigh on him. Every lead had gone cold, every message unanswered. "This is bigger than one race," Toto reminded him. "Whatever happens today, you've had an incredible season." Lewis nodded, but they both knew what was at stake. An 8th World Championship would make him the most successful driver in the sport's history. As Lewis began his pre-race ritual, a young security guard approached the Mercedes hospitality area. He'd been moved by the story of the old racing. "Instructor waiting outside. There's a man at the main gate," he told one of the team members. "Claims to be Robert Mitchell. He has old credentials and knows things about Mr. Hamilton's early career." The team member sighed. "Another one? We've had several fake Robert Mitchells already." "This one seems different," the guard insisted. "He's not asking for anything. Just wants to wish Mr. Hamilton good luck." "What did he look like?" the team member asked. "Older gentleman. Gray hair. Speaks very technically about racing. Has a slight limp." The team member paused. The limp matched what they knew about Roberts. "Old racing injury? Did he leave anything?" The guard nodded, producing a folded piece of paper. "Just this note." The team member unfolded it. The handwriting was neat and precise. "Lewis, I still remember the day you took Cop's Corner flat out for the first time. You were scared, but didn't show it. I told you talent is good, but courage makes champions. You've proven that 1,000 times over. Good luck today. No matter what happens, I'm proud of you. RM." The detail about Cop's Corner struck a chord. It wasn't public knowledge, something only someone who had been there would know. "Get this to Lewis," the team member instructed. "Right away." 20 minutes before the race, as Lewis sat in final preparation, the note was delivered to him. He read it twice, his hands shaking slightly. "Where is he?" Lewis asked urgently. "Main entrance, apparently. But we can't bring him in without proper—" "Find him," Lewis interrupted. "Please, it's really him." As Lewis walked toward the grid, his mind was suddenly clear. The note had awakened something. A memory of that day at Cop's. The fear. The exhilaration. The pride in Robert's eyes afterward. Whatever happened in the next 2 hours, Lewis knew he would drive with everything he had, not just for the championship, but for the man who had believed in him from the beginning. Outside the circuit, Robert waited patiently in the growing heat, unaware that his note had finally reached its destination. "Lights out and away we go," the commentator shouted as 20 Formula One cars launched from the grid. Lewis Hamilton made a perfect start, immediately gaining 2 positions into the first corner. Outside the circuit, Robert had found a small cafe with a television showing the race. He sat, nursing a cold drink, watching as Lewis battled through the field. The heat was intense, even in the shade. "Your friend is driving well today," the cafe owner commented, noticing Robert's intense focus on the screen. "He's not my friend," Robert replied quietly. "Just someone I taught a long time ago." Back at the track, the Mercedes team was in a frenzy. 2 staff members had been dispatched to find Robert Mitchell, armed with a description and a special paddock access pass authorized by Toto Wolff himself. "Check every entrance," the team manager instructed. "This is important to Lewis." On track, Lewis had moved up to 3rd position by lap 20, but Verstappen led comfortably. Lewis's race engineer spoke calmly over the radio. "We need another 3/10 per lap to catch him, Lewis." "It's possible." Lewis's reply was determined. "I'll find it." At the main entrance, The young security guard who had passed Robert's note approached his supervisor. "The man I told you about, the instructor. I think he was genuine." The supervisor looked skeptical. "We get people claiming connections to drivers all the time." This was different, the guard insisted. He knew things, and now Mercedes is looking for him. The supervisor sighed. What did he look like again? Outside, Robert checked his watch. His flight back to England departed in 4 hours. He would need to leave soon to make it to the airport. On screen, Lewis had closed the gap to second place and was now chasing down Verstappen. "Remarkable driving. From Hamilton," the commentator exclaimed. "He's finding speed no one else can find on these tires." Robert smiled with pride. Lewis was using every technique they had practiced. Late apex in the hairpin, early throttle through the sweeping curves, perfectly balanced braking into the chicane. "He still remembers," Robert whispered. With 15 laps remaining, Lewis had caught Verstappen. The two championship contenders battled wheel to wheel, neither giving an inch. The crowd was on its feet. "Guys, I think I've found him," a Mercedes team member radioed in. "There's an older man watching the race at the Desert Sun Cafe, half a mile from the main entrance. Matches the description perfectly." "Are you sure it's him?" came the reply. "He's making predictions about Lewis's driving line before they happen. It's definitely him." In the Mercedes garage, Toto Wolff made a quick decision. "Bring him here, now." On track, Lewis made his move, sweeping around the outside of Verstappen in a breathtaking maneuver that few drivers would dare attempt. The Mercedes team erupted in cheers as Lewis took the lead. "Beautiful!" Robert exclaimed in the cafe, drawing looks from other patrons. A moment later, a woman in Mercedes team gear approached his table. "Mr. Mitchell?" she asked. Robert looked up, surprised. "Yes?" "I'm from the Mercedes team. Lewis Hamilton would like to meet you after the race." Robert's heart raced. "How did you find me?" She smiled. "Lewis insisted we search everywhere." He read, "Your note." Robert stood, suddenly uncertain. "I should probably go." "My flight. We'll arrange another flight," she assured him. "Please come with me." As they walked toward the circuit, Robert could hear the crowd roaring. On screens outside, he could see Lewis crossing the finish line in first place, securing both the race victory and his record-breaking 8th World Championship. In the cool-down room before the podium ceremony, Lewis was handed a phone. "We found him," said the voice. "Robert Mitchell is here." Lewis Hamilton stood on the podium, the winner's trophy raised high above his head as champagne sprayed around him. The crowd roared, celebrating his 8th World Championship. He had made history today, surpassing even the great Michael Schumacher. But Lewis's mind was elsewhere. As soon as the ceremony ended, he rushed through his media obligations, giving short answers to journalists' questions. "Lewis, how does it feel to be the most successful driver in history?" a reporter shouted. "Amazing. Incredible." "Team did a great job," Lewis replied, already moving toward the next question. Toto Wolff intercepted him as he tried to exit the media pen. "Lewis, slow. Down! Enjoy this moment!" "Is he still here?" Lewis asked urgently. Toto nodded. "Waiting in your private room." "I made sure no one else knows." Lewis took a deep breath. "Thank you." As he approached his room in the Mercedes hospitality area, Lewis felt a flutter of nervousness. What would he say to the man who had given him so much, yet disappeared from his life for nearly 20 years? He opened the door slowly. There, sitting awkwardly on the edge of a chair, was Robert Mitchell, older, grayer, but unmistakably the same man who had taught him to find the perfect racing line at Silverstone all those years ago. Robert stood as Lewis entered. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the noise of the celebrating team muffled behind the closed door. "You found me," Robert said finally, his voice slightly hoarse. "You found me first," Lewis replied. At the gas station, a small smile crossed Robert's face. "I didn't think you'd recognize me." "I didn't. Not then." Lewis shook his head. "I'm sorry about that." "Why would you?" "I was just one of many instructors." Lewis stepped forward. "No, you weren't. You were the one who saw something in me when others didn't. You stayed late to teach me. You pushed me harder than anyone." "Robert, look down. I just did my job. Why didn't you say something at the gas station? Or when I started looking for you?" Robert hesitated. "It's complicated." Lewis gestured to two chairs in the corner of the room. "I have time now." They sat, the weight of 2 decades between them. Lewis noticed Robert's worn shoes, his faded jacket. Signs of a life far removed from the luxury of Formula One. "I heard you're working 2 jobs," Lewis said gently. Robert nodded. "Taxi during the day, gas station at night." "Why? What happened to your teaching career?" Robert explained about the racing school changing hands, the budget cuts, his struggle to find another position in racing. "You could have contacted me," Lewis said. "I would have helped." "That's exactly why I didn't," Robert replied, his voice firm. "I didn't want you to feel obligated. Your success is yours, Lewis. You earned it." Lewis shook his head. "No one succeeds alone. I had my dad. I had Ron Dennis. I had Mercedes. And I had you." A knock interrupted them as a team member poked his head in. "Lewis, they need you for the champions' photos in 5 minutes." "I'll be there," Lewis promised. When they were alone again, he turned back to Robert. "Will you stay? Come to the team celebration tonight?" Robert looked uncomfortable. "I don't belong in that world." "Yes, you do," Lewis insisted. "More than many people there." He paused. "I want to help you, Robert. Not out of obligation, out of gratitude, out of respect." Robert's expression remained guarded. "I came to congratulate you, not to ask for anything." "I know that," Lewis said. "That's why I want to help even more." He leaned forward. "What if you taught again? Not at some school, with me, with the Lewis Hamilton Foundation, teaching underprivileged kids, giving them the same chance you gave me." For the first time, Robert's composure cracked, emotion flickering across his face. "You would do that?" "In a heartbeat," Lewis replied. "But first, please come celebrate with us tonight. Meet my team. Let me introduce you properly, as the man who helped make me the driver I am." Robert hesitated, then slowly nodded. "All right, but on one condition." "Name it." "You have to explain to everyone that I didn't come looking for favors, that I stayed away all these years because—" Robert stopped abruptly. "Because what?" Lewis asked, curious about Robert's sudden silence. Robert shook his head. "It doesn't matter now." But Lewis could see in his eyes that it mattered very much. There was something Robert wasn't telling him, something important. "There's more to this story, isn't there?" Lewis asked quietly. Robert met his gaze. "Yes, but not here, not now, after the celebration. I promise." The Mercedes celebration was unlike anything Robert had ever experienced. In a luxurious Abu Dhabi hotel ballroom, the team that had just won both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships celebrated with champagne flowing freely. Music pulsed through the room as team members sponsors, and celebrities mingled. Robert stood awkwardly at the edge of the party, watching Lewis move through the crowd. Everyone wanted to congratulate the champion, to touch greatness, to be part of history. Lewis handled it all with grace, but Robert noticed how he kept glancing over, making sure Robert hadn't disappeared again. Toto Wolff approached, extending his hand. "So you're the famous Robert Mitchell. Lewis has told me you taught him some special skills." "Nothing special," Robert replied modestly. "Lewis was already exceptional." "That's not how he tells it," Toto said, smiling. "He says you saw something in him that others missed." Before Robert could respond, Lewis appeared at his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Everyone, I have an announcement," he called out, his voice cutting through the music and chatter. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the champion. "This man beside me is Robert Mitchell," Lewis began. 20 years ago, he was my instructor at Silverstone. He believed in me when I was just a kid with a dream. He stayed late after everyone left to teach me techniques I still use today." Robert felt his face flush as hundreds of eyes turned to him. "Without him, I might not be standing here as an 8-time world champion," Lewis continued. "So tonight, we're not just celebrating our team's success, we're celebrating the people who helped us on our journey, the ones who saw potential and nurtured it." The crowd applauded warmly. Robert nodded in acknowledgement, uncomfortable with the attention but touched by Lewis's words. As the party continued, Lewis introduced Robert to engineers, team members, and even celebrities who had come to celebrate. Everyone treated him with respect, listening intently to his observations about Lewis's early driving style. Later, as the celebration began to wind down, Lewis led Robert to a quiet terrace overlooking the illuminated Yas Marina circuit. "Sanfanikin, you for coming tonight," Lewis said. "It meant a lot to me." Robert nodded. "It was unexpected. Your whole team made me feel welcome." "They understand the journey," Lewis replied. "No one gets here alone." A comfortable silence fell between them as they gazed at the track where history had been made hours earlier. "So," Lewis said finally, "you promised me an explanation." Robert took a deep breath. "I did. Why did you really stay away all these years? Why didn't you reach out when my career took off? And what stopped you from telling me who you were at the gas station?" Robert studied his hands for a moment. "I made a promise, Lewis. A promise I kept for 20 years. To whom?" "Your father." Lewis stared at him. "My dad? What are you talking about?" Robert turned to face him fully. "The extra training sessions we had, the early mornings, the special techniques, they weren't part of the regular program. Your father paid for them privately." "What?" "No, he couldn't have. We barely had money for the regular classes." "That's why he didn't want you to know," Robert explained. "Anthony worked extra jobs, saved every penny. He approached me privately and said he'd noticed I had taken an interest in your driving. He asked if I would give you advanced training." Lewis shook his head in disbelief. "But why keep it secret?" He was adamant about that. He didn't want you to feel the pressure of knowing how much he was sacrificing. And he didn't want you to doubt yourself, to think you needed special help to succeed. He wanted you to believe your success came from your own talent and hard work. "Which it did," Lewis insisted. "Of course it did," Robert agreed. "But your father gave you every opportunity he could, often without you knowing. The day you left the school, he made me promise never to tell you. He said, let him think he did it himself. That promise is why I never contacted you, why I didn't say anything at the gas station." Lewis turned away. emotion overwhelming him. All these years, he had known his father sacrificed for his career, but he hadn't known the full extent of it. "There's one more thing," Robert said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a faded envelope and handed it to Louis. "Your father gave me this to give to you if we ever met again, after you'd made it," as he put it. With trembling fingers, Louis opened the envelope. Inside was a simple note in his father's handwriting. "I always believed. Love, Dad." Louis wiped tears from his eyes. "I need to call him." As Louis pulled out his phone, Robert stepped back, giving him privacy. The 8-time world champion was suddenly just a son again, grateful for a father's love that had shaped his destiny. Louis dialed, waiting as the phone rang across continents and years of complicated history. "Dad? It's me. I just learned about the lessons with Robert. Yes, he's here with me now. Dad, I had no idea." Robert smiled gently and walked toward the exit. His part in this story was complete. But as he reached the door, Louis called out to him, "Robert, wait! Dad wants to talk to you too." And so the circle closed. 3 lives connected by racing, sacrifice, and dreams that had come spectacularly true. Thanks for joining me till the end. Let me know in the comments from where you are tuning in. Drop your city and country name in the comments. Also make sure to subscribe to this channel if you love Lewis Hamilton. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed this heartwarming story of friendship and second chances. See you in the next one.